Good morning. This is for A&P 1, North Dakota State, sheep brain dissection. First of all, we are looking at the dorsal view of a sheep brain. Normally there would be an outer protective layer called the dura mater. That is almost like a swim cap type of protective layer, very thick and durable. And then the mid layer is called the arachnoid layer. That's a little bit of a web-like type structure that adheres to that dura mater. And then ultimately there's the pia mater, which is that very tender third layer, innermost layer of the brain. And that here I've taken away a little bit. You can see with the layer you're able to try to puncture those different folds of the brain, and it doesn't work. But as soon as I remove that thin little layer of that pia mater, you can see how easy it is to compromise that brain and that fold. So those protective layers are extremely important, of course. As we look here at the dorsal view, we're going to go through the different lobes pretty quickly. We have our frontal lobe, which is responsible for motor function, our parietal lobes, which is responsible for receiving and processing sensory information, and occipital lobes here in the back end, responsible for receiving and processing information from our eyes. And inferior to the parietal lobes, we have our temporal lobes, which receives and processes auditory sensations and information. If we look at these folds a little bit more closely, those here are under a layer of the pia mater, but those lobes here, these folds, also known as hills, are called gyrus or gyri, and they have little valleys, little grooves here that are called sulci or sulcus. Again, the right and left cerebral hemispheres, that is divided by the longitudinal fissure, also known as the commissural fissure, and we'll dissect that a little bit closely here in a minute. We have our spinal cord, our cerebellum. These little grooves that correspond through here are the vermis of cerebellum, and back here we have the medulla oblongata. So three parts of that brainstem, again, medulla oblongata, the pons, and the midbrain, which we'll take a closer look at here in a second. The ventral view, the inferior view of the sheep brain, is our olfactory bulbs and our optic nerves, this optic chiasm, which crosses those nerves, that right and left optic nerve, also known as cranial nerve 2. We have sheep on our homestead, and if you know anything about them, they're not the smartest creatures on the planet, but they do have some great well-developed senses. And so these are some well-developed olfactory nerves and bulbs that then trickle down here to our our optic chiasm, optic tract, and right under that is where the pituitary gland normally is. That's been since removed, and that's also known as the infundibulum. Underneath that is the optic tract, the mammillary body. We have a couple of nodular structures here, the cerebral peduncle, then down to the pons, the medulla oblongata, and that spinal cord. Two more cranial nerves here as well, number 5 and 6, trigeminal nerve, as well as the abducens nerve. So now we're going to flip this over and look a little bit more closely into the posterior view. If we open that up here, you can see this has been dissected already, so we're having a little bit of a trouble there, but you can see two different sections of the colliculi. We have our superior colliculi as well as the inferior colliculi. The superior is responsible for eye reflexes, while the inferior is responsible for our auditory reflexes. This is also known as the mesencephalon. And again, here's our cerebellum. Known as the small brain, but it is responsible for a lot of muscle coordination. It does have an outer cortex that controls or covers these folds, and again, that's called the vermis. So you have your cerebrum, known as the higher brain, as well as your cerebellum. Once we dissect that down the middle, down that longitudinal fissure, you'll see we have the two different hemispheres there, and we look a little bit closer into the cerebellum, and we have these white tree-like structures that is known as the arbor vitae. So we have white matter, which is offset by the gray matter. That white matter is what gets the information moving and is made up of myelinated axons, whereas the gray matter is unmyelinated axons, cell bodies, dendrites, and somatic terminals, and that is responsible for connecting that information. Again, as we go up through here, as part of the brain stem, we have the medulla oblongata, the pons. We ultimately reach the thalamus, which is the relay system. All of our information goes through that main center and then sent out to the appropriate cortex. And underneath that, we have the hypothalamus. Here in this midbrain is responsible for hearing and visual reflexes, all those sensory type reflexes. Again, here is that optic chiasm, and we have the pituitary gland as well as the pineal body, and those are responsible for a lot of endocrine function. Here's that main kind of wave structure, that corpus callosum. That's that main membrane that is responsible for keeping the communication alive and well between the left and right hemisphere. Underneath that corpus callosum is a little bit of a membranous section here that is part of the lateral ventricle. Normally this has a membrane over it, which I've since opened up, that septum pellicidum. But this has a membrane that then opens up into the lateral ventricle. We have 4 ventricles, those 2 laterals, 1 on each hemisphere, then our 3rd ventricle, which meets up with our 4th ventricle here in the cerebellum. And connecting that 3rd and 4th ventricle is the cerebral aqueduct. There also you'll find the choroid plexus, which produces our CSF, our cerebral spinal fluid. In addition to the thalamus and hypothalamus, we have our fornix, which is superior to the thalamus. And I believe that might cover everything we have here. We also have that transverse fissure as well. Again, the cerebellum is responsible for coordination. Our medulla oblongata is responsible for different reflex controls, heart rate, blood pressure, that sort of thing, respiration. And I think that pretty much completes the inner portion of the mid-sagittal structure of the brain. So there we have it, 2 different structures. We also took a little bit of a cross-section just so you can closely see a little bit more closely the white matter versus the gray matter here when you take that section off, a little bit near the thalamus there. So that will complete the sheep brain dissection. Thank you.